So what was the reaction from people in Kirklees to these abolitionists who were visiting throughout the 19th century? And it's sometimes really hard to figure that out across the board, right? Audience reaction. And that's not just from a Kirklees standpoint, that's just from a British and Irish standpoint. We have the odd diary entry, but often, and the most common, is trying to glean a reaction from a local newspaper report. And specifically talking about Kirklees, Black activists seem to have had, for the most part, great success here. So Frederick Douglass and William Craft's lectures in Huddersfield in particular were very successful. Turner Williams' lectures in Honley and Holmforth were very well received, probably because Williams actually accompanied his lectures with a panorama, a very large painting. James Watkins spoke in several places in Kirklees throughout the 1850s and early 1860s, always to packed audiences. Often chapels, churches, town halls were packed. People actually had to leave because they physically couldn't get in. And Watkins in particular was reported in the Huddersfield Chronicle various times. And one correspondent notes that a lecture that Watkins gave in Holmforth was very successful. And the correspondent writes that from the numbers attending, it would seem that the lectures lose none of their interest. So he lectured a couple of times in this particular area. And then in Honley, Watkins gave 2 lectures. And the second one, again, I'll just quote from the correspondent, dwelt on his escape from slavery, his sufferings in the wilderness, how he was hunted by his cruel oppressors and their bloodhounds. And these incidents portrayed in this second lecture were thought to be even more interesting than those in the first, and they were listened to with their corresponding attention. So the anticipation for these lectures was also really, really high. So in January 1860, the Huddersfield Chronicle reports that there was a very high anticipation for Sarah Parker Remond's lecture that month. The pioneering activist Sarah Parker Remond lectured all the way around England throughout the late 1850s and early 1860s. And this particular newspaper correspondent writes that her language is said to be exceedingly impressive and delightful, and crowded meetings have welcomed her wherever she has stood up to advocate the interests of her oppressed people. But it's important to think about, obviously, all sides of this story. And it wasn't always the case that activists were welcomed with open arms to Kirklees. So again, taking the same newspaper, the Huddersfield Chronicle, a newspaper correspondent wrote in July 1851 covering the lectures of Henry Box Brown. This is a particular lecture he was giving in Dewsbury. And this correspondent writes, Mr. Henry Box Brown, the well-known fugitive slave, exhibited his unrivaled panorama in a large room behind the Centenary Chapel in Dewsbury. It sets forth in very striking colours the awful extent and the vast amount of evil carried on in that so-called land of liberty, America. We are sorry to say that that exhibition was but indifferently supported. So despite what the correspondent is saying here, and that it's worth going to see this panorama, there wasn't a lot of people in Dewsbury going to this particular meeting.